A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking this: "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And he said to him, "Well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments, the gospel of the Lord." You shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Well, devils roll the dice, angels roll their eyes. What doesn't kill me makes me want you more. So those are lyrics from the number one song in the country this week, which is Taylor Swift's "Cruel Summer." I'm assuming that the song is about her frustrations with some particular person that allowed her summer to not go so well. I don't know if it was last summer or the summer before, I don't know. The song, I'm assuming, has re-entered to the top of the charts and gained more listening power given her recent release of the movie that's about her tour, which is a brilliant business move on her part. Not only did the tour do really well, but now the movie about the tour is now succeeding. Why not? You're already doing the tour, you're filming it. So she does these wonderfully creative and really shrewd moves in order to put her music out there. And so here we are, reflecting on a cruel summer on a day, at least here in the mid-Atlantic, that feels like a last breath of summer kind of come back to us in the midst of beautiful fall brilliance on this Halloween weekend. So we have a little taste of summer before it cruelly, you might say, goes away, and we go deeper into the fall and the winter. Well, this Halloween weekend, I thought of those lyrics about, devils rolling dice and angels rolling eyes, because, the whole city's sort of bustling in that kind of Mardi Gras-esque break that Halloween gives us, a way of sort of checking out of our news feeds and our regular and typical worries and entering into kind of some sort of, carnival-esque, like I said, fantasy kind of break, to dress up, to I don't know, have fun, to be not our typical selves, right? It's kind of what Halloween has become, especially among our college students. And it might be needed because our regular news is not really great. There's a lot of stuff going on that's just pretty horrific. Between these major wars, not to mention the lots of other wars that have been festering for years that don't even get any news coverage now. Then we have, of course, what is nearing now our 500th almost. We're not quite there, but we're almost there, sadly. Our 500th and worst, at least for this year, mass shooting, which again, we're going to end up in complicated and deeply divided debates about what's the proper response, the solution there. And we're going to, maybe see ourselves stuck again around any number of these topics, any number of these problems that we're experiencing. The warm weather itself, you enjoy it while you can, but don't think too much about it, lest you start to think about climate change. So there's lots and lots of tough news out there, and like I said, we might in some ways think of how it is that we get a little bit of a break from that by entering into the Halloween kind of holiday. But I'm a big believer that you and I need to not look at the undead and ghoulish decorations of Halloween, but we might need in some ways a way to move away from that cruelty and into something that does change our season, at least the season within our heart, the season within our mind. And this gospel may be exactly what you and I need, because I think it allows us to really look at the very basics, those very, very essential teachings of Jesus in his proclamation of the reign of God's love. They've already tried to trip Jesus up. They want, of course, allow him to make some mistakes so that they can get the civil authorities to prosecute him and kill him and get him out of their way. This is what the Pharisees are trying to do to Jesus. They will eventually succeed, as we know. But in this gospel, they've tried a lot of other things, more clever things, you might say. But then they kind of go to the core here and say, what's the greatest commandment? Because as soon as we get into a comparative, right? What is this greater than that? And you start ranking things, we can get ourselves in trouble, right? It's right when we rank things that we can all of a sudden say, well, you said this was better than that, so then these are going to feel left out or that. So they're trying to get him to compare theological teachings here about God so that they can trip him up. And interestingly enough, Jesus again outmasters them with his basic commandment. Yeah, there's lots and lots of commandments in the Old Testament. There's the 10 great commandments, but there's lots of other codes and maxims and suggestions of all sorts, powerful suggestions, complicated suggestions. But they want him to try to rank them and do the comparative. And Jesus says, look, the greatest commandment is simply love God. Love God with your heart, mind, and soul, though. He qualifies it by saying it has to be something that's deep within you. And if it's not, there's a problem. It's got to be this deeply sensed, deeply felt, deeply realized within you love of God. And not that it has to be over the top and super pious or outrageously dramatic. That's not what he's suggesting. It needs to be deeply understood, maybe in a quiet but extremely grounded way. And in fact, if it were extremely grounded, it might not be some loud expression, but a solid confidence, a deep sense of faith that God is accompanying me and that I can love God because God has loved me into existence. And then he follows it up with the second great commandment. The second one is just like the first, he says, because it's going to require something of ourselves. And in fact, it requires a look at ourselves. Love your neighbor as yourself, which brings up the whole issue of, well, how do we love ourselves? How do we care for ourselves? How do we, in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, there's any number of places where St. Ignatius suggests we look at ourselves as God looks at us. We need to do that every once in a while in order to get a sober, but often compassionate and realistic understanding of ourselves, because we can fall into lots of misconceptions, some of which can just be more brutal than any judging God would offer us, a more brutal kind of judgment, a harshness. It could also then lead us into a complete ignorance of what might be the truth of ourselves, both the good and the bad, those behaviors that are really applaudable and loving, and those behaviors that are not that. So friends, I think today you and I are challenged not to go running about this weekend and thinking about an escapism into the Halloween weekend, but instead for you and I to think about a sober and real look at ourselves, to let this moment of summer flash not be a cruel last moment of summer, but instead a real understanding of a change of season for you and for me, and maybe a change of heart and mind, so that we can more deeply enter into that love of God that is ours, our task, our call, and then be grounded too in how we can practice that love that we learn in the relationship with God, with one another. And if we do that, my friends, we're going to have a better perspective on the difficult things, the deep divisions, the conflicts, the violence around us. We're going to have a perspective that allows us to look at that in new ways. And that's what we need to do in order for us to move forward in some way that allows us to change our world and to be ourselves agents of that change. But the requirement for you and me is here in this gospel to do the work of being that agent of change by simply acknowledging the very basic things that we're commanded to do by Jesus of Nazareth. And that is, Christ asks you and me to love God with a wholeness of self, mind, heart, soul, and then to let that whole self, which God has created and God can heal and God can give us the graces we need to step forward with those gifts, to be neighbor to one another, to allow us then to love ourselves and our neighbor in some kind of a deeper and holistic way. And then you and I start to build the very relationships that help transform our world into something that isn't what we might be reading about in our news feeds. So yeah, let the devils roll the dice and the angels roll their eyes, but you and I, we have more than some kind of a chance or some kind of a you and I have these two commandments that can guide us here and now into this new season, into a new season of heart, mind, and soul that allows us to be who we're called to be and build the world that we need to build by Christ's command. Amen.